Mr. President, yesterday the Senate Foreign Relations Committee reported the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015. To the surprise of many people, including me, it was unanimously reported, which makes me begin to wonder just how much Iran nuclear agreement review there'll be in this act. I was an original co-sponsor of the Corker-Menendez bill that would give Congress and the American people a voice in what's likely to be the most significant nuclear arms agreement in this decade. I think the likelihood as we move toward the agreement as it appears to be structured is that you won't be able to contain the desire of other people in the neighborhood and maybe in other places in the world, but certainly in the neighborhood, to want to be just as capable of producing a nuclear weapon as we allow Iran to be. Supporting this bill does mean that I think the Congress really gives the opportunity for these negotiations to advance, not Congress putting the brakes on these negotiations. Specifically, the bill would give Congress the opportunity to review and weigh in on a deal that's already been made. It does appear to prohibit the administration from removing sanctions while Congress reviews and while Congress votes on a final deal, if that's what Congress decides to do. Doesn't require Congress to vote, as I read it, but I look forward to having the people who unanimously voted for this in the Foreign Relations Committee explain how it really does involve the Congress as the Constitution would suggest the Senate would be involved. This does permit removal of sanctions only if the Congress passes a joint resolution approving the agreement, I've been told. The new bill reported out of committee makes the following changes in the original bill. Under the new bill, the congressional review period isn't going to be 60 days, it would be 30 days. The new bill removes the provision requiring the administration to certify to Congress that Iran is not providing material support to terrorists plotting against the homeland or against United States entities. We continue to be told that, well, that's a different topic. I don't know why that's a different topic at all. A nuclear-capable Iran that is supporting terrorism is obviously more dangerous than a nuclear-capable Iran that's not supporting terrorism. The weapon that you can see being built, the weapon that would compare to weapons that we may have built in other powers in the past, perhaps not nearly as dangerous as the weapon being built that could be used by some terrorist. This bill does, it appear, give the Congress the ability to intervene, but only to intervene after the parties have made the deal. I'm not particularly offended by that. The administration, if this was a real treaty, would obviously be negotiating that treaty and then would bring the treaty to the Senate for approval, as the Constitution requires, as has happened over and over again on treaties involving nuclear capacity, nuclear ability, nuclear buildup, or nuclear build down. That's not a new thing for the Senate to deal with, but apparently nobody in the administration wants this to be this kind of treaty. Now, there is apparently a way to weigh in before it's implemented, but in a way that I think we're going to have to look at very carefully if and when that legislation comes to the floor. A nuclear-armed Iran, an Iran that is nuclear weapons capable, whether that's in 6 months or 12 months or monitored or unmonitored, a nuclear weapons capable Iran is a major threat, in my view, to the United States. It's a major view to our allies, major threat to our allies in the region. And lifting these sanctions only empowers Iran to have more influence in the region. The sanctions did bring Iran to the negotiating table, but they've been given a lot of breathing room since these negotiations started a couple of years ago. We wouldn't be negotiating, I don't think, if the sanctions hadn't been working. And with what's happened to oil prices, those sanctions would have even had a more dramatic effect on an economy of a country where we have every reason to believe that the population is inclined to be very friendly toward the United States. They're educated, they're capable, they have long-term ties with many of their family members in this country. But of course, the population is not in control of the country. The country is controlled by a small group that has only one view of how the world can work. And frankly, that small group appears to have only one view of what they think about the United States of America. And if you listen to the comments that the leader, the supreme leader, the religious leader makes over and over again, that view is dependably negative about our country and our people and our system of government and our ability to live side by side with each other. So we should be concerned about that. The agreement would allow them to continue to enrich uranium. It would allow them to retain centrifuges, which we said, by the way, we wouldn't do. That was a point we wouldn't negotiate away. It would allow them to continue to have thousands of centrifuges, something else we said we wouldn't allow them to do. It would allow them to continue developing new and better and more sophisticated ways to enrich uranium, to weaponize, to have the ability to create a weapon. And frankly, it's not even clear, Mr. President, what agreement has been agreed to. If you listen to our description of the agreement, that's a very different description of the framework. There's no agreement. Everybody agrees to that. But there's supposedly a framework. This framework would build two very different houses. If you listen to their description of the agreement and you listen to our description of the agreement, you're looking at very different things. This week, for example, the Supreme Leader saw this very differently than the President. The so-called deal with respect to when the sanctions would be removed, what would be happening. President Obama and Secretary Kerry have put a tremendous amount of effort into reaching an agreement. In fact, such amount of effort that it's been clear from the very start of the negotiations who wanted an agreement the most. What hasn't been clear, and what isn't clear to me, is why we're so eager to just check the box and move on here and assume that sometime in the next few years, Iran will become a friendlier state and will not want to head in this bad direction. I think not only does it head Iran in a nuclear weapons direction, but it heads many other people in the neighborhood in a direction of wondering, if they have this capacity, why wouldn't we want to have this capacity? Most Americans don't believe that Iran will stick to a deal. And frankly, Mr. President, I had great questions about that myself. Whether the President likes it or not, this is an international agreement with wide-ranging consequences. The Congress and the American people have a role to play here. The Foreign Relations Committee has made a proposal about what that role should be, but it seems to me that proposal is still a long way from the constitutional protection that should be involved when we reach an agreement of this kind, or when we negotiate a treaty. Now, Mr. President, a number of us sent a letter that got a lot of attention a few weeks ago, and I thought the reaction to that letter was pretty interesting. The immediate reaction from the Secretary of State was, well, this isn't a treaty, it's just an agreement. The Senate doesn't have to approve an agreement. The President would be bound by it, and it will be such a good agreement, according to the Secretary of State, that the next president would want to be bound by it as well. This is a pretty significant moment to decide that we may or may not be bound by what's decided. The Iranian foreign minister then was able to give us some sense of his understanding. That I think the phrase that he said the next day was, well, you know, international law is what really matters here, not the law of any given country. I've been all over my state, as many of us have in the last couple of weeks, and I don't think there's any courthouse or any coffee shop or any gathering of people in Missouri where they would say, well, really international law is what we care about. We don't care about what the Constitution says when you're dealing with other countries. And then the President's Chief of Staff Mr. President, 72 hours after that letter was sent, said that really the president would probably want to take this to the UN, but he probably wouldn't want to take it to the United States Senate. We'll see how this debate goes on the proposal that the Foreign Relations Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee is making, but it clearly does not go in the direction of a treaty approved by 2/3 of the members of the United States Senate. In my view, we're still a long way from the final agreement. There seems to be a lot of disagreement as to what the framework means. But as we move toward that final agreement, our number one priority should be to do everything possible to prohibit Iran, whose influence in the world and the region is already disproportionate, to prohibit Iran from having the capacity to ever have a nuclear weapon. I hope our negotiators continue to keep that in mind, and I hope there's not nearly as much disagreement about the final agreement as there is about what the framework itself says. And I would yield the floor, Mr. President.